Good morning again. This is the Scythe Wielder here. The theme of whom you know by now is that the testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The aspect of God's testimony that I want to point out today is the imprecatory nature of prayer. When you read the Psalms, you see the psalmists, and since that was the songs of the church, their religious worship, all of Israel and Judah would be crying out psalms that would remind God of His promises, remind God of His covenant, remind God of His relationship with Israel and Judah, and often confessed faults of Israel and Judah before God. A lot of confession of sin in the Psalms, and a lot of also of confessing the attempt and the intent to keep the law of God without changing it. And many times, many times, reminding God how oppressed Israel and Judah were by their adversaries, how their enemies outnumbered them, and even their teeth and tongues were weapons the enemies used against Israel and Judah. And then to call on God over and over and over, call on God to send justice to Israel and Judah and to protect them from their enemies and to make their enemies ashamed and to erase their enemies. The 37th Psalm actually talks about how God would remove the evil man who had grown in his place like a big bay tree in its native soil, that you would look for that man and he wouldn't be there. Be no evidence that he was there. No stump, no root. So there was a strong imprecatory theme in the Psalms of the Old Testament. But in the New Testament we kind of get the feeling that we're always just supposed to take it. They mistreat us. That's the way it is in this world. We don't see victory till we die and go to heaven. And at the same time, you'll hear people talking about spiritual warfare, who are still talking about you don't really see victory till you die and go to heaven. I want to tell you that the testimony of the Lord is not like that. We'll start with the words of Jesus, who told us about a woman who went to a judge all the time, trying to get that judge to get justice for her. But that judge had no regard for men, and he had no regard for God. He didn't care who was hurt. He didn't care who was injured. He didn't care who did the injuring. But she kept coming, saying, protect me, get me justice. And finally, in the end, he said, oh gosh, go get that woman some justice. Take care of her business, because she's wearing me out. I got stuff I need to do. And Jesus reminds the people that God's not like that unjust judge. God looks on his people, and He's wanting to help them and wanting to send them justice. And the writers in the Old Testament recognized that about God. They knew that He was in a hurry to help Israel and Judah, but we don't realize that He's in a hurry to help us too. But Jesus says, call upon those who cry out for justice from the Lord day and night. God will send it speedily. Jesus says God will send it speedily. Yet, when the Lord returns, He says, who will He find faith on the earth? In other words, all throughout history, even Christian history, we've seen the Lord come to the rescue of various Christian groups. But there's something that happens towards the end of days that indicates that the people don't really have faith in God's goodwill towards them. They don't really think they don't have faith in Him. But Jesus says, cry out day and night, and God will send justice to His elect. Paul his form of spiritual warfare was to turn people over to Satan for the destruction of their flesh. He did it to a Christian man, or a man who was part of the church in Corinth, and he did it to two men who were not part of the church. They were actually pagans, as I recall. Turned those two men over for the destruction of their flesh, so they'd learn not to blaspheme. And the man who was part of the church turned him over for the destruction of his flesh, so that his spirit would be saved in the day of Christ. So there was a spiritual warfare. Paul knew that he had an authority to protect and to keep Satan out of his sphere of influence. But and he knew that power extended to even the pagans. But he also knew that it would be good for some if they learned not to blaspheme, and he knew that the one who could do it would be Satan. Satan knows how to bring a person down. So he would thrust the man who was having an illicit relationship with his dad's wife. He thrust him out of the protective sphere that he held over his sphere, over his area, and turned him over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, so that his spirit would be saved in the day of Christ. Wouldn't that be better? To have a spirit saved in the day of Christ than whatever the option was. And two unbelievers, attackers of the faith, I think they were silversmiths or something, making idols for Diana. He turned them over to Satan for the destruction of their flesh, so they'd learn not to blaspheme. So there were three aspects, occasions when Paul exercised authority. Not to be nice. Certainly he put up with a lot with people. And he did not take vengeance into his own hands. He didn't judge the crime and set the sentence, or execute the sentence. He says, "Okay, I'm going to put this over here and let nature take its course." Or he knew how Satan goes around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Paul, in another place, says, "Let all those who love not the Lord Jesus Christ be accursed. The Lord comes." Maranatha. So there's two edges of this coin, two sides of this coin. On one side, Jesus says, "Cry out day and night, that the Father will send you justice." The other side of that coin is, when justice comes, all those who love not the Lord Jesus Christ are accursed. And we see this again in Revelation, when the Revelator is talking about Babylon the Great. He says that he hears from heaven, "Come out of her, pay her back double." Come out of her, my people. Pay her back double. As she has lived wantonly and luxuriously while afflicting you, so pay her back double affliction and trouble. So there is a payback, and we get involved in the payback, and that is part of ruling with Christ on earth, is being involved in the payback. but it's never taking vengeance into our own hands. There's so many aspects of reigning on earth with Christ. His word is a sword, and we can wield the word. And knowing that we have the power to loose on earth what God has loosed in heaven, and we have the power to bind on earth what God has bound in heaven. Knowing that the testimony says, whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Whatsoever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, is sure. We need to be praying in agreement and declaring in agreement things bound or loosed according to the testimony of the Lord that tells us and makes us wise concerning such things. So, another place that we learn there's a payback was when Paul wrote to the people of Thessalonica, and he told them that, the Thessalonians are treating the Christians bad, and just like the people of Judah were treating the Christians bad in Judea. But it says God counts it righteousness to afflict those who afflict you. So there's righteousness, peace, and joy, but sometimes when we've endured and we've been patient, God's ready to kick in and send justice. One of the things that Jesus read about himself, applied to himself, or that was written, that we read in the New Testament, that was applied to Jesus, is that he would come and lead forth justice to victory. Jesus will come back and he will judge the nations. He will smash the nations like clay pots with a rod of iron. And those nations that have protected captivity, and those nations that have protected murder, you can't use those nations anymore. All you can do is you can crack them, break them, smash them to smithereens, and get that unclean influence out of the pantry. So we look for Jesus. We say, even so, Lord Jesus, come quickly, as we read in the Revelation. We see Maranatha. Let all those who love not the Lord Jesus Christ be accursed. Let it happen. If you don't, you'll be like the people in Corinth. Paul wrote to them in 2 Corinthians 6. He told them, don't receive the grace of God in vain. He said, your bowels are straitened in you, not because the apostles have shortchanged you, but because you've been yoked together with unbelievers. See, there's a curse on those who love not the Lord Jesus Christ. And if you are yoked together with them, you have to bear that curse with them. If you're in a yoke, if you got two horses in a yoke, two oxen in a yoke, pulling a wagon, they both have to bear the load, whatever's in that wagon. If you're yoked together with an unbeliever pulling a wagon, and part of the load in that wagon is curse, part of it's damnation, you have to pull it just like the other guy. But you know what? The unbeliever's not going to pull as hard as you are. He's going to let you pull and do more than your share. And you will do more than your share. Because you don't know to let those who love not the Lord Jesus Christ be accursed. Stop being yoked together with unbelievers is the word. Come out from among them, touch not the unclean thing, and I will make you my sons and my daughters. And seeing that we have such a great promise from God, we ought to just do that. Just simply walk out of the camp and bear the reproach of Christ outside the camp. And then let the fire come down on the city. When Lot and his wife left the camp, then the judgment that God had for Sodom and Gomorrah fell. We need to cry out for justice day and night, that the Father in heaven would send justice, would send His Son to lead forth justice unto victory. And we need to get out of the way. Stop sharing the curse with the unbeliever. Let those who love not the Lord Jesus Christ have all the curse that they deserve for ignoring and wasting and setting aside the grace of God, continuing to want to operate in the world's debt system, the world's treasure holding system. We're holding treasures in the world which needs slaves, and it needs people killed in order to keep that thing going. Get out of it. Touch not the unclean thing. This is the sign we want to remind you that the testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple.